Nap time, your grandpa? Captain Sterling kicked the duffel bag aside. The gym went dead silent. The old man sat motionless, possessing the density of a collapsed star. Deaf, too, Sterling sneered. Bet you peeled potatoes. What did they call you? Sarge. The veteran turned. His eyes were like open graves. Sterling's grin faltered. Not Sarge. Sterling forced a laugh. Let me guess. Iceman? Like the movie. The old man stood, suddenly towering over the captain. They did call me Iceman. Cute, Sterling scoffed. Nerves of steel. No. The veteran stepped closer. Because I never left anything warm behind. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. If this journey of valor touched you, consider subscribing to Silent Veterans and help us give a voice to more incredible stories of our silent veterans. The persistent ache in Silas Kincaid's left shoulder was more reliable than the weather report on the base news channel. When the barometric pressure dropped over Fort Moore, the old shrapnel buried deep near his clavicle, a parting gift from the Tet Offensive of 1968, began to throb with a dull, electric rhythm. Outside the Victory Sports Center, the Georgia sky had turned the color of a bruised plum, unleashing a torrential downpour that hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the massive gymnasium. The rain was relentless, a curtain of gray that washed out the colors of the basee, turning the manicured lawns and brick barracks into a monochrome film. Inside, the atmosphere was a stifling cocktail of ozone, rubber, floor wax, and human exertion. Silas adjusted his grip on the barbell. At 82 years old, his hands were maps of his history. The skin was papery, translucent enough to show the blue veins beneath, and spotted with age. But underneath the weathering, the tendons were like steel cables forged by decades of hard labor and harder warfare. He wasn't a large man anymore. Time had whittled him down, stealing the bulk he had carried in his 30s, leaving behind only the essential machinery needed to keep moving. He wore a pair of heather gray sweatpants that were likely older than most of the soldiers training in the room. The elastic was gone, held up by the knot of the drawstring. His t-shirt, once a crisp olive drab purchased at a PX in Saigon, had faded to a ghostly gray, stretched thin across his broad, bony shoulders. There were no morale patches on his sleeves, no grunt-style logos, no loud proclamations of patriotism or aggressive slogans about violence. Silas believed that service was something you did, not something you advertised on a billboard. He took a slow, measured breath, inhaling the scent of chalk dust and iron. He lowered the weight to his chest. The burn was good. The burn told him he was still alive. In a world that seemed determined to forget men like him, the iron was the only thing that still treated him with honest indifference. Gravity didn't care about your pension. Gravity didn't care about your nightmares or the friends you left in the mud. It just pushed back. 2. Yo, check out the dinosaur. The voice drifted over the squat rack, loud and performative, cutting through the bass-heavy hip-hop blaring from the overhead speakers. Silas didn't break his cadence. He pressed the weight up, his elbows locking out with a slight tremor that he hated but couldn't control. The tremor wasn't fear. It was the wiring coming loose after 8 decades of use. He racked the bar with a metallic clang and sat up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. Standing at the foot of his bench was a trio of officers, looking like they had just stepped out of a recruitment poster for the modern digital military. In the center stood Captain Brock Sterling. He was the picture of modern military perfection, 6'3", a jawline sharp enough to cut glass, and a fading high and tight haircut that was perfectly regulated to the millimeter. He wore a moisture-wicking tactical compression shirt that highlighted every muscle group, and on his wrist sat a tactical GPS watch that probably cost more than Silas's monthly disability check. Sterling wasn't just looking at Silas, he was looking through him. He was looking at an obstacle. "Can I help you, Captain?" Silas asked. His voice was a low rumble, like a distant thunderstorm. It was a voice that hadn't been raised in anger in 20 years because he had learned long ago that the loudest man in the room was usually the first one to die. Sterling smirked, glancing at his 2 lieutenants, who flanked him like eager bodyguards. They were clones of their leader, young, fit, and radiating that dangerous mix of arrogance and inexperience that often got platoons killed. "Yeah, you can help me," Sterling said, stepping closer. He invaded Silas's personal space, his expensive cologne clashing with the smell of honest sweat and old fabric. You can help me understand why you've been hogging the only flat bench in the gym for the last 20 minutes. We've got a battalion PT test coming up, real training to do. Silas remained seated. He didn't stand to attention. He didn't flinch. He simply looked at the captain's boots. Clean, polished, unscuffed. They were boots that had never walked through a rice paddy filled with punji sticks dipped in buffalo dung. They were boots that had never been caked in red mud and dried blood. I have 2 sets left, Silas said calmly. Then it's all yours. 2 sets. Sterling laughed, a harsh, barking sound that drew the attention of the nearby lifters. A few privates on the treadmills slowed down to watch, sensing the alpha dog posturing. Pop, look at you. You're shaking. You're going to hurt yourself, and then I'm going to have to fill out an incident report. Why don't you go use the elliptical? Or better yet, go to the rec center and play some checkers. This area is for the warfighters. The word hung in the air like smoke. Warfighters. Silas felt a cold spike in his chest. It wasn't fear. It was a profound, aching sadness. He looked around the gym. He saw the young men and women, strong and capable, but he also saw the disconnect. They looked at him and saw a relic, a wrinkled inconvenience. They didn't see the sacrifice etched into the lines of his face. They didn't know that the reason they could stand in this air-conditioned gym, safe and secure on American soil, was because men like Silas had crawled through hell on their bellies to hold the line against the darkness. I'm fine, Captain, Silas said, his voice hardening slightly, gaining an edge of steel. And I'm a veteran. I have the right to use this facility. It says so on the door. Sterling's eyes narrowed. The amusement vanished, replaced by the sneer of a man who wasn't used to being told no. He crossed his arms over his chest, flexing his biceps, physically expanding to dwarf the seated old man. A veteran, huh? Sterling mocked, looking Silas up and down with exaggerated scrutiny. I see a lot of civilians claiming that these days, stolen valor is a real problem, old-timer. You got an ID? You got any proof you ever served a day in your life? Or did you just buy those sweatpants at the surplus store to feel like a tough guy? One of the lieutenants, a redhead with a fresh sunburn, chuckled. Probably served in the Salvation Army, sir. Special Forces Laundry Unit. Call sign, Bleach. The other lieutenant joined in. Careful, sir. He might hit you with his cane. Right, Sterling continued, playing to his audience now. He raised his voice so the surrounding Marines could hear him clearly. See? That's the problem with your generation. You think you're owed something. Respect isn't an entitlement, Pop. It's currency. And right now, your account looks empty. What did you do? Clerk typist, motor pool. Did you bravely defend the base from a shortage of paperclips during the Cold War? Silas stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and painful. His knees popped audibly. He stood eye to level with the captain's chest. He wasn't imposing physically, but there was a density to his presence, a specific gravity that suddenly made the air around the bench press feel very thin. I did my job, Silas said softly. Same as you. I served the homeland. Same as me. Sterling stepped back, feigning shock. Don't insult me. I am an infantry officer. I lead the tip of the spear. I am responsible for the lives of 200 Marines. You are responsible for what? Making sure you don't slip in the shower. The insults were becoming personal, cruel. Sterling was enjoying this. He was marking his territory, asserting dominance over the weak member of the herd. It was a primitive display, one that Silas had seen 1,000 times in the jungle, usually right before things went very wrong for the loudmouth. You know, I bet you were never even in the mix, Sterling sneered, leaning in close enough that Silas could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. I bet you spent your whole enlistment scrubbing toilets in Jersey. That's why you don't wear a hat. That's why you don't wear a shirt with your unit on it, because you're ashamed. You're a ghost, old man, a nobody. Silas looked into the captain's eyes. They were blue, clear, and completely empty of truth. They were the eyes of a man who had studied war in textbooks but had never smelled the copper scent of it. opening up a friend's stomach next to him. We didn't wear patches where I went, Silas whispered. Excuse me. Sterling cupped a hand to his ear theatrically. Speak up. I can't hear you over the sound of your irrelevance. We didn't advertise, Silas said, his voice steady, though his heart was beginning to hammer against his ribs, not from exertion, but from the rising tide of memory. And we didn't ask for recognition. We did it for honor. We did it for the man next to us. Yeah, sure, Sterling waved a hand dismissively. Secret squirrel stuff, right? It's classified. That's the convenient excuse for every washout who wants to sound like a hero. Let me guess. You were a sniper, a SEAL, a ranger. No, Silas said. Then what? Sterling pressed, his patience snapping. He pointed a finger at Silas's chest. Who were you? What was your call sign? Every operator has a call sign. Come on, humor me. Was it sleepy, grumpy, dopey? The lieutenants burst out laughing. The sound echoed off the metal walls, sharp and jagged. Silas didn't hear the laughter anymore. The noise of the gym was beginning to fade, retreating down a long, dark tunnel. The edges of his vision blurred. The gray floor mats seemed to turn into mud, thick, sucking red clay. They didn't call me grumpy, Silas murmured. What was it then? Sterling demanded, checking his watch. I'm waiting. Give me a name so we can have a good laugh and you can leave. Silas's right hand moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a somatic reflex, a survival mechanism triggered by the stress. His hand drifted to the pocket of his sweatpants, bypassing the fabric and diving deep. His fingers brushed against cold metal. It wasn't keys. It wasn't coins. It was a Zippo lighter. But it wasn't just a lighter. It was crushed. The steel casing twisted and fused together by intense heat. The metal was scorched black on one side and rough to the touch, like scarred skin. It had belonged to his spotter, a kid from Arkansas named Miller, who hadn't made it to the chopper in '68. Silas's thumb rubbed the jagged edge of the twisted metal, the totem. The sensation was electric. The moment his skin made contact with that ruined piece of steel, the reality of Fort Moore shattered. The fluorescent lights of the gym didn't just dim. They were extinguished by a sudden, blinding flash of white phosphorus. The smell of floor cleaner and body spray was violently scrubbed from his nostrils, replaced instantly by the heavy, wet stench of rotting vegetation, burning jet fuel, and the iron tang of blood. The hip-hop music stopped. In its place, a low, terrified silence fell. The kind of silence that only exists in the jungle when the birds stop singing because a predator is near. Silas was no longer an 82-year-old man in a gym. The arthritis vanished. The weakness evaporated. His heart slowed to a predatory rhythm. He looked at Captain Sterling, but he didn't see the clean uniform anymore. He saw a silhouette in the mist. He saw a target. They called me Iceman, Silas whispered. But the voice wasn't his own. It was the voice of a man who had died 50 years ago and had been walking around in a body ever since. Iceman? Sterling laughed, shaking his head. God, that's corny. Like the movie pilot. Let me guess, because you were cool under pressure. No, Silas said, his eyes locking onto Sterling's with a sudden, terrifying intensity that made the young captain's smile falter for the first time. The temperature in the space between them seemed to drop to freezing. Because, Silas continued, the words coming out like bullets loaded into a chamber. By the time you knew I was there, you were already cold. Silas gripped the twisted Zippo in his pocket so hard his knuckles turned white. The flashback washed over him like a tidal wave of black water, pulling him down, down, down into the mud of the Escalating Valley. The gym was gone. The rain outside was gone. There was only the mission. The world did not transition. It collided. The sensation of the warped Zippo lighter against Silas's thumb acted as a ripcord, yanking him violently from the climate-controlled safety of the Fort Moore gym and dropping him 2,000 feet into the suffocating green hell of the Escalating Valley. May 14th, 1968. The heat hit him first. It wasn't just temperature. It was a physical weight. A wet, heavy blanket of humidity that smelled of rotting teak, wet fungus, and ancient, undisturbed earth. The air was so thick you didn't breathe it so much as swallow it in ragged gulps. Silas wasn't an 82-year-old man with arthritis anymore. He was 24. He was a master sergeant in MACVSOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, running Recon Team Viper. He was 160 pounds of coiled wire and aggression, his face painted in stripes of black and green grease paint that stung his eyes as the sweat poured down his forehead. They were deep, over the fence. Deep. Technically, they weren't supposed to be in Laos. Technically, they didn't exist. If they died here, there would be no flags, no letters home, just a classified file burned in a burn barrel in Saigon. Silence was the only policy. "Sarge," a voice whispered behind him. It was Miller, Private First Class Toby Miller from Little Rock, Arkansas. He was 19 years old, with a face full of freckles and a spirit that hadn't yet been crushed by the war, though the ASHA was trying its hardest. Miller was the radio operator, RTO, carrying the 30-pound PRC-25 radio on his back like a penitent carrying a cross. Thumb movement, Miller breathed, the word barely audible over the droning buzz of a million cicadas. Silas raised a clenched fist. The patrol, 4 indigenous Montagnard mercenaries, the Yards, and 2 other Americans, Tex and Doc, froze instantly. In the jungle, movement was death. Stillness was life. Silas crouched low, the mud seeping instantly through the knees of his tiger-stripe fatigues. He scanned the perimeter. The jungle here was a triple canopy nightmare. Massive mahogany trees blocked out the sun, creating a permanent twilight on the jungle floor. Below them, elephant grass grew 7 feet tall, sharp enough to slice your skin like a razor. Wait, a minute vines hooked onto gear, skin, and weapons, fighting every step. He didn't see anything, but he felt it. It was a vibration in the ground, a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure. The birds had stopped screaming. The monkeys, usually chattering in the canopy, had gone silent. Silence was the loudest sound in the war. Silas hand-signaled for the team to fan out into a defensive perimeter. He crept forward, his CAR-15 rifle tucked tight into his shoulder. He moved with the agonizing slowness of a chameleon. 1 step. Wait. Listen. Check for tripwires. Wait. Another step. He pushed aside a massive fern frond, the size of a car door, and looked down into the ravine below. His blood ran cold. It wasn't a patrol. It wasn't a squad. Below them, moving along a hard-packed trail that shouldn't have existed, was an entire North Vietnamese Army battalion. They were moving south, toward the Ashao, hundreds of them. They wore pith helmets and fresh green uniforms. They carried AK-47s, RPG launchers, and heavy mortars strapped to reinforced bicycles. They moved with a discipline that was terrifying. Silas watched, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He counted. 50, 100, 200, 300. This was the invasion force intelligence had been looking for. This was the hammer that was about to fall on the Marines at Quai San. He slowly, excruciatingly, pulled back. He crawled on his belly through the mud, ignoring the leeches that were already latching onto his neck and wrists. He made it back to Miller. "Get on the horn," Silas whispered, his lips brushing Miller's ear. "Covey Rider. Emergency traffic. We have a regiment-sized element moving south. Grid reference." Miller nodded, his eyes wide. He unhooked the handset. Click. The sound was microscopic, the friction of plastic on plastic. But in the cathedral-like silence of the waiting jungle, it sounded like a gunshot. Below them, the marching stopped. Silas stopped breathing. A shout in Vietnamese echoed up the ravine. Then another. Then the distinctive metallic clack-clack of 100 safety selectors being flipped off. They had been heard. "Run!" Silas hissed. "Go to the rally point. Go!" The stealth was over. The team exploded into motion, scrambling up the slick, muddy slope. But the enemy was fast. Green tracers zipped through the foliage, snapping branches and shredding leaves. The sound was deafening, a tear in the fabric of the world. "Contact! Contact front, Tex screamed, opening up with his M60 machine gun. The heavy thump, thump, thump of the pig chopped through the vegetation, buying them seconds. But they were cut off. Silas saw the NVA soldiers swarming up the hill like ants. They were everywhere. Flanking left, flanking right. The team was being herded, pushed toward a sheer cliff face. "Miller, move your ass!" Silas grabbed the kid's harness and hauled him over a rotting log. A mortar round impacted 20 yards to their left. The ground heaved. The concussion knocked the wind out of Silas, slamming him face first into the muck. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine. He scrambled up, spitting mud. "Doc, Tex." No answer. Just the roar of AK-47s and the screams of men dying. Silas looked back. He saw Doc fall. His chest erupted in red mist. The Montagnards were fighting hand-to-hand with NVA regulars who had broken through the line. It was chaos. It was slaughter. "Sarge, I'm hit," Miller cried out. Silas spun around. Miller was on the ground, clutching his thigh. Bright arterial blood was pumping between his fingers, mixing with the black mud. The radio on his back was sparking, shattered by a round. Silas grabbed him by the drag handle and pulled. "I got you. I got you, kid." He dragged Miller into a depression under the root system of a massive banyan tree. It was a small hollow, barely big enough for 2 men, shrouded by hanging vines and thick roots. It was a grave, or a fortress. "Quiet," Silas commanded, pressing his hand over Miller's mouth. "Do not make a sound." The enemy was on top of them. Silas could see their boots through the gaps in the roots, canvas jungle boots, splashing through the mud less than 3 feet from his face. He could smell them. The pungent tobacco they smoked, the scent of unwashed uniforms and fish sauce. There were dozens of them. They were sweeping the area, executing the wounded. A single gunshot rang out nearby, then another, the coup de grace for the yards. Silas lay on top of Miller, shielding the boy's body with his own. He pressed his face into the mud, closing his eyes. He became a stone. He became a root. He became the silence. This was the moment. This was where the Iceman was born. Miller was whimpering. The pain was tearing him apart. His leg was shattered. He started to thrash, his survival instinct demanding he scream, demanding he run. "No," Silas whispered, a sound so faint it didn't even vibrate his vocal cords. He locked eyes with the kid. "Stay with me, Toby. Stay with me." Miller's eyes were wild, dilated with shock. He reached up, gripping Silas's collar. His lips were blue. "Mama," Miller mouthed. "I want my mama." Silas felt the tears burning the backs of his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He couldn't. Tears required emotion, and emotion required heat. He had to be cold. He had to be ice. Above them, an NVA officer was shouting orders. He was standing right on top of the root system. Dirt crumbled down onto Silas's neck. If they moved, if they breathed too loud, they were dead. And not just dead. Captured, tortured, skinned. Miller's breathing was becoming ragged. The blood loss was sending him into shock. He started to convulse. Silas had to make a choice that would haunt him for every single night of the next 50 years. He shifted his weight. He placed his hand firmly over Miller's mouth and pinched the boy's nose. It wasn't to kill him. It was to stop the gasp, to stop the scream that was building in the kid's throat. Miller stared up at him, panic warring with trust. Silas stared back, pouring every ounce of strength, every ounce of brotherhood he had into that gaze. "I am here," Silas's eyes said. "You are not alone. But you have to be quiet." Miller's thrashing slowed. His grip on Silas's collar loosened. The light in his eyes began to fade. Not from Silas's hand, but from the artery that had been severed by the bullet. The life drained out of him in the dark. Muddy hole beneath the roots. While the enemy walked overhead, Silas felt the exact moment Toby Miller died. The tension left the boy's body. He became heavy. And Silas lay there, holding the corpse of his friend. For 72 hours, he didn't move. He didn't weep. He didn't shake. The NVA set up camp right there. He could hear them eating. He could hear them celebrating. Silas slowed his own heart rate down until he was practically in a coma. The ants crawled over his face, biting his eyelids and his lips. He didn't brush them away. The leeches engorged themselves on his neck. He didn't pull them off. He lay in the embrace of the dead, becoming one with the rot. He froze his heart. He froze his soul. He was no longer a man. He was a block of ice in the middle of the jungle oven. On the third night, under the cover of a monsoon storm, he moved. He didn't leave Miller. Loyalty wouldn't allow it, but he couldn't carry the body and complete the mission. He took Miller's dog tags. He took the crushed Zippo lighter from the kid's pocket, the one Miller had been flicking nervously just that morning. He put it in his own pocket. Then, Silas hunted. He didn't have enough ammo to take them all on, but he had a knife, and he had the cold. He slipped out of the root system like smoke. He moved through the enemy camp. He didn't kill for revenge. Revenge was messy. He killed for survival. He slit the throat of the sentry nearest the trail, catching the body before it hit the ground, lowering it silently. He vanished into the tree line. He ran. He ran for 2 days. No food, no water, just the driving force of duty. He had to get the intel back. He had to tell command about the battalion. By the time he reached the extraction point, a small clearing on a ridgeline, he was hallucinating. He saw Miller walking next to him. He saw Doc. When the Huey finally came, dropping the ladder through the canopy, Silas climbed it with the last reserves of his energy. As the chopper lifted off, swaying in the wind, the door gunner looked at Silas. The sergeant was covered in mud, dried blood, and leeches. His eyes were 1,000-yard tunnels staring into nothing. "You okay, buddy?" the gunner shouted over the rotor wash. "You're the only one?" Silas didn't answer. He just sat on the floor of the chopper, his hand in his pocket, gripping the Zippo lighter. He was freezing. Despite the humid heat of Vietnam, he was shivering violently. "Get this man a blanket," the pilot yelled. "He's freezing to death back here." The gunner threw a wool blanket over Silas's shoulders. "What's your name, soldier? What call sign?" Silas looked up. The jungle below was shrinking, becoming a green carpet. The hell was down there. But he had brought a piece of it with him. "Ice," Silas whispered. "What?" "Iceman," Silas said, his voice devoid of all humanity. "Because I don't feel anything anymore. I am frozen." The memory swirled and coalesced, spinning faster and faster until it shattered against the hard reality of the present. The jungle vanished. The scream of the Huey rotors faded, replaced instantly by the thumping bass of the gym's sound system and the metallic clatter of weights. The smell of cordite and rotting vegetation dissipated, overtaken by the scent of floor wax and sweat. Silas Kincaid blinked. He was back on the bench press. His hand was still in his pocket, clutching the Zippo lighter. The metal was warm now, leaching the heat from his feverish memory. He had been gone for 3 seconds. To the outside world, he had just paused to take a breath between insults. But inside, he had lived a lifetime. He had felt the mud again. He had felt Miller die again. He looked up at Captain Sterling. The young officer was still sneering, his arms crossed, waiting for the punchline. "I'm waiting, old man," Sterling said, checking his expensive tactical watch again. "Iceman, really? Did you fly jets too? Don't tell me you forgot the rest of your fairy tale." Silas removed his hand from his pocket. He didn't pull out the lighter yet. He just let his hand drop to his side. The trembling in his hands had stopped. The arthritis pain was gone. His posture had changed. He wasn't slouching anymore. He was sitting with the predatory stillness of a tiger waiting in the long grass. The Iceman wasn't just a nickname. It was a state of being. He looked at Sterling, and for the first time, the captain flinched, because the eyes looking back at him weren't the cloudy eyes of an 82-year-old pensioner. They were the eyes of the survivor. They were eyes that had watched a friend bleed out in the mud and had stared down a battalion of killers without blinking. "You think it's a joke?" Silas said. His voice had changed. It wasn't the raspy whisper of an old man anymore. It was cold, clear, commanding. It carried the weight of authority that didn't come from brass pinned to a collar, but from the iron in the blood. "I think you're wasting my time." Sterling laughed, though the sound was nervous now. "I think you need to pack up your little gym bag and—" Sterling's voice died in his throat. At that exact moment, the double glass doors of the gym entrance slid open with a pneumatic hiss. The light from the rainy Georgia afternoon spilled in, silhouetting a group of figures entering the facility. The air pressure in the room seemed to change, sucking the oxygen out of the lungs of every Marine present. The gym manager, a retired sergeant major who usually spent his mornings reading the paper, looked up from the front desk. His coffee cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. He scrambled to his feet, knocking his chair over in his haste. "Attention on deck!" the sergeant major bellowed, his voice cracking with urgency. The music was cut instantly. The clanking of weights stopped. The treadmills were paused. Every Marine in the building, 50 of them, froze in mid-motion and snapped to the position of attention. 2 men in dark suits walked in first, Secret Service or CID, scanning the room with professional paranoia. Behind them walked a man wearing a raincoat over a Service Alpha uniform. He stepped into the gym, shaking the rain from his shoulders, and removed his cover. 4 silver stars gleamed on each collar. It was General Marcus Thorne, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the highest-ranking officer in the branch, a man whose reputation was as formidable as the tanks he commanded. And he was walking straight toward the bench press. Captain Sterling's face went pale. He panicked. The adrenaline spiked in his veins. He quickly smoothed his compression shirt, checked his align menu, and puffed out his chest. His mind raced. The general is here. He must be here for a surprise inspection. Or maybe he's here to visit the base commander. He's coming right at me. "General on deck," Sterling shouted, snapping to a rigid salute. His elbow was perfectly angled, his fingers aligned. "Good afternoon, General. Captain Sterling, 2nd Battalion." Sterling held the salute, his eyes locked forward, his heart pounding. He waited for the acknowledgement. He waited for the validation. He waited for the general to notice the perfect specimen of a modern officer standing before him. General Thorne walked past him. He didn't even look at the captain. He walked past the 2 lieutenants who were trembling so hard their knees were knocking together. He walked past the weights. He stopped 3 feet in front of Silas Kincaid. The room was silent. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear the rain hitting the roof. The general, a man who commanded 200,000 Marines, a man who answered only to the President of the United States, looked at the old man in the dirty gray sweatpants and the faded t-shirt. Thorne didn't speak. Slowly, with immense reverence, the general raised his hand. He didn't salute Captain Sterling. He saluted Silas. It was a slow, 3-second hold. A salute of absolute deference. A salute usually reserved for the Medal of Honor, or for the dead. Silas looked at the general. He didn't salute back. Civilians don't salute. He just nodded. A slow, weary acknowledgement of one warrior to another. "At ease, Marcus," Silas whispered. The room collectively gasped. A civilian had just told a 4-star general to be at ease, using his first name. The general dropped his hand. He looked at Silas with eyes that were wet with emotion. "We thought you were dead, Gunny," the general said softly. "We've been looking for you for 6 months. The VA lost your file." "I'm not dead," Silas said, glancing sideways at the terrified Captain Sterling. "Just frozen." The general followed Silas's gaze. He finally acknowledged Sterling. He looked at the captain, then he looked at the bench press, then he looked back at Sterling. The general's expression hardened. The warmth vanished. The face of the friend disappeared, replaced by the face of the god of war. "Captain," the general said. His voice was quiet, but it hit Sterling like a physical blow to the gut. "Sir!" Sterling squeaked, still holding his salute because he hadn't been given permission to drop it. "Drop your hand, Captain, you look ridiculous," Thorne snapped. Sterling dropped his hand, shaking. "Why is this man standing?" the general asked, pointing at Silas. "And why are you occupying his air?" "Sir, I, Sterling stammered. "I was unaware of the individual's status. He was out of uniform. He was occupying equipment during peak training hours. I was merely enforcing standard gym protocol regarding... Protocol, the general interrupted, testing the word as if it tasted like spoiled milk. Thorne turned his head slowly, his eyes sweeping over the gym. You were enforcing protocol, Thorne continued, stepping closer to Sterling until he was uncomfortably close. Tell me, Captain, do you know who this man is? No, General, Sterling whispered, sweat dripping down his nose. I assumed he was a dependent or a retiree. A retiree, Thorne repeated. He shook his head. This man is Master Sergeant Silas Kincaid. But in 1968, inside the borders of a country we weren't officially supposed to be in, he was known as Iceman. Sterling blinked, the name again. You asked him about his call sign, Thorne said, his voice rising so the whole room could hear. You mocked him. You thought it was a joke. I didn't know, sir, Sterling pleaded. He is called Iceman, Thorne continued, not because he was cool, but because he lay in the mud for 3 days, motionless, while the enemy walked over him. He slowed his heart rate. He froze his body. He watched his best friend die 3 inches from his face and didn't make a sound, because if he had screamed, the entire mission would have failed. The general paused, letting the horror of the story sink in. He saved 3,000 Marines at Khe Sanh because he chose to be cold. He chose silence. And you. You have the audacity to ask him to move so you can work on your biceps. The revelation hit the room like a shockwave. The young Marines looked at Silas with new eyes. They didn't see an old man anymore. They saw a titan. Thorne signaled to one of the agents behind him. The agent stepped forward and handed the general a thick, black folder. The seal of the Department of Defense was stamped on the front in gold foil. We didn't come here to work out, Silas, Thorne said, turning back to the veteran. I came to deliver this personally. The review? Silas asked. It's done, Thorne said. Operation Black Mist is declassified, all of it, the mission logs, the radio transcripts, the casualty reports. Silas felt a weight lift off his chest, a weight he had carried for 50 years. The truth was finally free. And, Thorne added, opening the folder, we found the recommendation. The general pulled out a piece of paper. It wasn't a copy. It was the original carbon paper document, yellowed with age, stained with dried mud. Attention to orders, Thorne barked. The command was automatic. The gym snapped to attention again. General Thorne began to read. The President of the United States takes pride in presenting the Navy Cross to Master Sergeant Silas Kincaid for extraordinary heroism, for refusing to evacuate, for extreme valor in the face of overwhelming enemy forces, for maintaining position under direct observation to provide critical intelligence. The words washed over Silas. He didn't feel pride. He felt peace. Thorne finished reading. He lowered the paper. The official ceremony will be at the White House next month, Thorne said. But I wanted you to know first. You aren't a ghost anymore, Iceman. You're home. Silas looked at the general. Then he looked at Captain Sterling. The captain was trembling. He looked destroyed. He looked like a man who had just realized he had been mocking a god. Captain, Silas said. Sterling flinched. Yes. Master Sergeant, you asked about my call sign, Silas said, stepping forward. You asked if it was from a movie. I was wrong, Sterling choked out, tears streaming down his face. I am so sorry, I had no right. Silas reached into his pocket. He pulled out the twisted, melted Zippo lighter. He held it up. This belonged to Toby Miller, Silas said. He was 19. He died so I could keep quiet. He died so you could have that uniform. He died so you could have the freedom to be an idiot in a gym. Silas pressed the lighter into Sterling's hand. He closed the captain's fingers over the cold, scarred metal. Keep it, Silas said. Sterling looked down at his hand, stunned. Master Sergeant, I can't. This is... Keep it, Silas repeated firmly. I'll put it on your desk, and every time you feel like judging a man by his sweatpants, every time you feel like your rank makes you better than the person standing next to you, you look at that lighter. You remember what the cold feels like. Sterling looked at the lighter. He nodded, unable to speak. Yes, Master Sergeant, he whispered. Silas turned back to the general. Thank you, Marcus. "Can I give you a ride home, Silas?" the general asked. Silas looked at the barbell on the bench press. He had one set left. "Not yet," Silas said. He sat back down on the bench. "I have one set left. And the Iceman never leaves a mission unfinished." General Thorne smiled. He looked at the room full of Marines. "You heard the man," Thorne yelled. "Spotters." 4 young privates rushed forward, tripping over themselves to help the legend. Silas lay back. He inhaled. 1. The bar went up, and the whole gym erupted in cheers. The echo of the iron plate slamming against the rack signaled the end of the set and the end of an era. Silas sat up, wiping his hands on his pants. The 4 young privates were looking at him like he was Captain America. "Good set, Master Sergeant," one of them whispered. "Good spot, Marine," Silas said. He stood up and walked toward the exit, the general by his side. The entire gym parted like the Red Sea. No one spoke. They just watched. They were witnessing living history walking out the door. As they reached the glass doors, Silas stopped and looked back at Captain Sterling one last time. Sterling was standing alone by the bench press, clutching the Zippo lighter to his chest. He looked broken, but in the way a bone breaks before it heals stronger. "He'll be all right," Silas said to the general. "He just needed to freeze a little." "You taught him a lesson he'll never forget," Thorne said. "I didn't teach him," Silas replied, pushing the door open and stepping into the rain. "Miller did." They walked to Silas's beat-up Ford truck. The general waited while Silas unlocked the door. "You know, Silas," Thorne said. "The offer stands. You can come back and train the recon boys. They need to learn about the mindset, about the silence." Silas climbed into the truck. He looked at his hands. They were old, but they were steady. "Maybe," Silas said, "but right now, I think I'm just going to go home and turn up the heat. I've been cold for a long time." Thorne smiled and saluted. "Semper Fi, Iceman." "Semper Fi, General," Silas said. He started the engine and drove away, leaving the base behind. He left the accolades, the awe, and the noise. He drove back to his quiet life. But he wasn't alone anymore. The ghost of Toby Miller was finally resting easy. 3 months later, the Victory Sports Center was busy. Captain Brock Sterling walked onto the floor. He didn't strut. He walked with purpose. He went to the main bench press. He didn't load it up. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a polishing cloth. He wiped down a small brass plaque that had been bolted to the frame. "The iron never lies. Reserved for Master Sergeant Silas, Iceman Kincaid, Navy Cross recipient. Rank is what you wear. Respect is what you bleed." A new lieutenant walked up. "Hey, Captain, can I work in?" Sterling looked at the lieutenant. He smiled, a genuine, humble smile. He pointed to the plaque. "Read it," Sterling said. "Then find another bench. This one is for the Iceman." On Sterling's desk, back in his office, the melted Zippo lighter sat on a velvet cushion. It was the first thing he saw every morning. It was a reminder. The cold preserves, but it is the warmth of brotherhood that saves. Silas Kincaid never came back to the gym. He didn't need to. He had passed the torch. The legend of the Iceman was no longer a secret buried in a classified file. It was a story told in the barracks, a standard set for every young warrior who laced up their boots. And in the silence of the gym, between the clanking of the weights, if you listened closely, you could almost hear the whisper of the jungle and the quiet, steady breathing of a man who refused to break. If you were moved by the legend of the Iceman and believe that true heroes often walk among us in silence, please like this video, share it with a patriot, and subscribe to Silent Veterans. Help us keep their stories alive.